There is a word that appears over 70 times in Scripture, and almost every believer misunderstands it. Fasting. We think we know what it means. Skip a meal, deny yourself, prove to God you're serious, earn His attention through hunger. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If that's what you think fasting is, you've missed the entire point of why it exists in the Bible, and you may have spent years practicing a discipline while missing the very thing it was designed to reveal. Because fasting was never meant to move God toward you. It was meant to reveal what was already moving inside you. Every generation of believers absorbs its theology partly through what's said and partly through what's assumed. And somewhere along the way, fasting became one of those assumed things rarely defined, constantly practiced. Ask a room full of Christians why they fast, and the answers cluster around a handful of ideas: to break a stronghold, to get a breakthrough, to show God you're serious about a prayer request, to earn a spiritual reward that regular praying couldn't unlock on its own. Underneath all of these answers is the same hidden assumption that God's attention is somewhat withheld by default, and fasting is the currency that purchases it back. The more radical the fast, the more radical the breakthrough. Hunger becomes leverage. Suffering becomes a bargaining chip. This isn't entirely invented out of nowhere. It borrows real language from Scripture, real stories of fasting preceding real acts of God's power. That's what makes the misreading so durable. It's not fabricated, it's just incomplete, and incompleteness is often more dangerous than outright error, because it feels true enough to never be questioned. So we need to slow down and ask a harder question then: does fasting work? We need to ask, what does fasting actually reveal about the one doing it, and about the God they're doing it before? To find the answer, go to one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah 58. Picture the scene. Israel has returned, or is in the long shadow of exile, doing everything a devout nation is supposed to do. They are fasting, publicly, faithfully, regularly. And they are baffled, even wounded, that heaven seems unmoved. "Why have we fasted?" they cry out, "and you see it not? Why have we afflicted our soul, and you take no knowledge?" There is real pain in that question. These are not lazy worshipers going through empty motions carelessly. They are people who believe they are doing exactly what God asks, and they cannot understand His silence. And then comes God's answer, and it is one of the most piercing rebukes in the entire Old Testament. He tells them, through the prophet, that on the very day of their fast, they seek their own pleasure and oppress their workers, that they fast for strife and contention, striking with a wicked fist. That the kind of fast where a person merely bows his head like a bent reed and lies in sackcloth and ashes. Do you call this a fast, an acceptable day to the Lord? Then God describes the fast. He actually desires, and notice, it barely mentions food at all, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke, to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, to cover the naked, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh and blood. This is the first fracture in the popular reading, and it's a massive one. The fast God rejects is a fast of self-focused ritual hunger performed as spectacle, deprivation used as proof of devotion, while the heart underneath remains untouched by mercy, justice, or love for others. The fast God accepts isn't defined primarily by what you refuse to eat. It's defined by what you're finally willing to see: the oppressed, the hungry, the burdened, once your own comfort has been stripped away long enough to notice them. Fasting, in its truest biblical form, was never a private transaction between an individual and heaven. It was meant to crack open self-focus and pour it out toward others. Hunger was supposed to make you tender, not impressive. To understand why this rebuke lands the way it does, it helps to look at the word itself. The most common Hebrew term translated fast is tzom, and its root idea is closer to restraining or closing off than it is to punishing the body. It carries the sense of a deliberate narrowing, closing the mouth, yes, but more fundamentally, closing off the noise, the distraction, the reflexive reaching for comfort that normally fills a life. This matters enormously, because it means fasting was never primarily an act of self-punishment. it was an act of clearing space. Think of it less like a penalty imposed on the body, and more like a room being emptied out so that one voice, previously drowned out by every other voice, could finally be heard. There's a companion idea worth noticing too. The phrase often used alongside fasting in the Old Testament is afflicting the soul, not merely afflicting the stomach. The discipline was never really about the digestive system. It was about the soul being brought low enough, quiet enough, honest enough to actually listen. This is why fasting appears again and again in Scripture at moments of decision, crisis, or threshold, not as a magic key that unlocks God's favor, but as a way of stripping away the noise long enough to hear what was already true. Bread, in the biblical, was never treated as evil. It was treated as a symbol, the most immediate, tangible form of self-sustaining comfort available to a human being. And what fasting does, deliberately, is remove that comfort and ask a piercing question. When the obvious source of security is gone, what rises up in its place? Anxiety? Control? Self-pity? Or trust? That's the real test fasting performs. Not how much can I suffer to prove my devotion, but what does my soul actually reach for when its normal comforts are stripped away? Fasting doesn't create the answer. It reveals it the way draining a river reveals what was always lying on the bottom. Once you see this fasting as revelation, not leverage, the pattern becomes visible everywhere across the biblical story, and it reshapes every fasting narrative you thought you already knew. Consider Moses on Sinai, 40 days without bread or water, receiving the covenant words that will shape an entire nation. Notice what this fast is not. It is not Moses trying to convince a reluctant God to finally engage with Israel. The covenant relationship already exists. God has already delivered them from Egypt, already claimed them as his own. Moses' fast happens inside an established relationship, not as a means of establishing one. His emptiness on the mountain becomes the space in which he receives what God was always going to give. Consider David, fasting and lying on the ground for 7 days while his infant son is dying. This is raw, unfiltered grief, laid before God, not a performance of piety, not confidence that fasting will force a particular outcome, but honest wrestling. And when the child dies, David does something the culture around him would have found strange. He rises, washes, and eats. His servants are confused. But David's answer reveals the theology underneath the whole practice. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, "Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live, but now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again?" David never fasted to manipulate God's decision. He fasted as an act of honest appeal, and once the outcome was settled, he trusted God's sovereignty enough to stop. Consider Esther, calling an entire nation to fast for 3 days before she approaches the king, uninvited, a move that could cost her life. This fast doesn't change the king's temperament. It doesn't magically soften Persian law. What it does is align a terrified, scattered people around courage they did not naturally possess, preparing Esther internally for an act of obedience that required everything she had. Consider Daniel, deep in exile, discovering through Jeremiah's scroll that the appointed 70 years of Israel's captivity are drawing to a close, and his response is not celebration but fasting, prayer, and confession on behalf of a people who had failed to keep covenant. His fasting doesn't trigger God's plan. It's his response to a plan already in motion, a posture of humility that positions him rightly inside what God was already doing. Notice what is conspicuously absent from every one of these stories. Every one of them fasts standing at the edge of something enormous, a covenant being given, a life hanging in the balance, an impossible act of courage, a nation's future, and in that space, they need to be undivided, unclouded, fully present to what is happening. Fasting doesn't move God's hand. Fasting steadies the hands of the one standing before him. And this is where the whole story reaches its center, not in the temple, not among the prophets alone, but in a wilderness, 40 days into a fast, with a hungry man and a whispering voice testing the deepest fault line of what fasting was ever meant to expose. Jesus, led by the Spirit into the wilderness, fasts 40 days and 40 nights. And Scripture doesn't soften what happens to his body. He is hungry, genuinely, physically hungry, at the very edge of human endurance. And that is precisely the moment the enemy chooses to speak. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. Look closely at what is actually being tested here. This is not simply an appeal to physical hunger. It's an attack on identity and trust, wrapped inside the language of legitimate need. You're starving. You have the power to fix this yourself. Why wait on the Father? Prove who you are right now, on your own terms. This is the same temptation that unraveled Israel in their own wilderness, centuries earlier. A people who, hungry and afraid, demanded bread on their terms, tested God's patience, and grumbled their way through 40 years instead of trusting the God who had already proven himself faithful at the Red Sea. Jesus stands in that same wilderness, facing that same test, hungrier than any human being should be able to endure, and answers not with power, not with a miracle, but with Scripture. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. This is the moment the entire meaning of fasting finds its center of gravity. Christ, in his hunger, refuses to use his emptiness as leverage to force his Father's hand. Instead, he uses his emptiness to prove, publicly and irrevocably, where his fullness has always come from. Where Israel failed in the wilderness, Christ succeeds. Where the first Adam failed in a garden of abundance, tempted not by hunger but by desire, the second Adam succeeds in a wilderness of total scarcity. He becomes, in that fasted, weakened body, the true and faithful Israel, the Son who trusts the Father completely, even when trust costs everything visible. This reframes what fasting was always meant to be. It is not a technique for miracles. It is not a hunger strike aimed at heaven's door. It is a declaration made with the whole body of where trust actually lives. There is one more layer to this, and it may be the deepest one in the entire biblical story. Because the wilderness was not Christ's only emptying, it was a preview. On the cross, Jesus experiences the ultimate hunger not for bread, but for the Father's presence itself. My God, why have you forsaken me? Here is fasting carried to its absolute furthest point. Total deprivation, total abandonment of every visible source of comfort, every familiar assurance, every felt sense of nearness to the Father he had known intimately since before the foundation of the world. And it is precisely there, in that unbearable emptiness, that the redemption of the world is accomplished. This is the pattern the whole practice of fasting was quietly pointing toward, all along, from Isaiah's rebuke to Daniel's exile to a wilderness 40 days long. Emptying is not evidence of God's absence. Emptying is often the very place where God's greatest, most hidden work is unfolding unseen in the moment, unmistakable in hindsight. The tomb becomes the final image of this truth. 3 days of apparent silence, apparent defeat, apparent absence, and then resurrection. Not because emptiness earned it, but because the God who allows emptying is never actually absent within it. The resurrection is God's answer to every honest fast, every legitimate hunger, every place where faith had nothing visible left to stand on. It is proof that what looks like the end of the story is very often the doorway into its deepest chapter. Trace this thread all the way back to Genesis, and you find it was there from the beginning. Abraham on Mount Moriah, walking 3 days with his son, and no visible way out, discovering that God provides Yahweh Yireh precisely at the point where every human resource had run dry. Trace it forward to Revelation, and you find a kingdom described not by scarcity but by a wedding feast, a table finally, fully set, hunger answered forever in the presence of the Lamb. Fasting sits in the middle of that story, a small, deliberate rehearsal of the larger biblical pattern. Emptiness is not the opposite of God's provision. It is very often the path toward it. If you have made it this far, there's a strong chance you're not just curious about ancient religious practice. There's a strong chance some part of this is landing somewhere real, a season of waiting, a prayer that hasn't been answered, a discipline you've practiced without understanding why it never seemed to work the way you were told it would. So let's bring this all the way down to where you are. If you have fasted, prayed, done everything you were told to do, and heaven still feels distant, hear this clearly: you are not failing some spiritual test of endurance. You may simply be discovering, the way Israel discovered in Isaiah's day, that God was never primarily interested in the discipline of your stomach. He was interested in the posture of your heart underneath it. The question fasting has always asked is not, how much can I give up to finally get God's attention? You already have His full attention. That was proven, definitively, on a cross, and sealed permanently in an empty tomb. You are not negotiating with a distant deity. You are the object of a love that already emptied itself completely on your behalf. The real question fasting asks is quieter and far more searching. What rises in me when everything I normally lean on is taken away? If what rises is anxiety, that is not failure, that is revelation. It's God gently showing you where your trust has been quietly resting on something other than Him. Not so you can feel ashamed, but so you can finally see clearly enough to hand it over. If what rises is silence, the same silence Christ faced in the wilderness, sit inside it the way He did. Not demanding stones become bread on your timetable, not manufacturing a breakthrough to escape the discomfort, but resting in the truth that the Father's word, even when it comes without an immediate answer, is enough to stand on. If what rises is grief, like David beside his dying son, bring it honestly, without performing a piece you don't yet feel. The biblical pattern was never stoic detachment. It was raw, unhidden dependence, followed by trust in whatever God ultimately allows. If you are in a season of obedience that costs you something and offers no visible reward, like Esther walking toward a throne room that could kill her, know that the emptying itself may be exactly the place where courage you didn't know you had is being formed. And if you are simply weary, uncertain whether any of this discipline means anything at all, remember Daniel reading an old scroll in exile, discovering that God's plan had been unfolding all along, even during the years that felt like abandonment. Sometimes fasting isn't about changing what's coming. It's about aligning your heart with what God has already been doing, quietly, the whole time. None of this is self-help dressed in Bible verses. This is the actual shape of a faith that doesn't reduce God to a vending machine and doesn't reduce you to a beggar trying to earn His notice. It's the shape of a relationship where emptiness is not evidence of distance, but very often the place where the deepest nearness is finally revealed the way it was in a wilderness, and the way it was, most completely, on a hill outside Jerusalem. Picture the wilderness, one final time. 40 days behind him, every physical resource stripped bare. No bread, no comfort, no visible proof of the Father's nearness, only a whispering voice offering him an easier way out. And still, Christ stands. Not because bread finally arrived to rescue him, not because the hunger suddenly ended. He stands because he never actually needed bread to stand on in the first place. His strength was never in what filled his stomach. It was in the word that had always sustained him, long before hunger and long after it. That is the real reason fasting attracts God's attention. It was never the hunger itself. It was always the trust that hunger reveals. If this reframed the way you see fasting, if it made you look at Scripture a little differently than you did 10 minutes ago, consider subscribing to our channel. There is far more hidden in these pages than most of us were ever taught to see.